Now let's look at this diverse group of fungi. Look at this beautiful picture of a single-celled yeast, different kinds of molds, and macroscopic fungi like the cup fungi and morels. Fungi belong in the domain Eukarya, and they have their own kingdom called the Mycetae, the kingdom of the fungi. From this kingdom, we're going to look at three groups, the phyla Zygomycota, Ascomycota, and Basidiomycota, where this diverse group of fungi belong. So, some features of fungi. Fungi can be unicellular, just like the single-celled yeast. They can also be multicellular, just like this mold growing on a plate or this mushroom. Fungi are eukaryote. Their DNA is enclosed in a nucleus. And what unique feature of fungi is their cell wall is made of this special material called chitin. Fungi are also chemoheterotrophs, meaning they will absorb the nutrients from the substrate that they are growing on. Just like this soil, the substrate where the mushroom is absorbing all the nutrients. So they are not photosynthetic, unlike the algae. One unique feature of fungi is they produce a lot of spores, and they do it by asexual or by sexual reproduction. This little bud is a type of blastospore produced by yeast cells. And if we take a mushroom cap like this and look under, we'll find lots of sexual spores called basidiospores. And if we look at a mold like this under the microscope, we can find lots of conidiospores organized in chains that helps them reproduce. So again, the spores are a unique way for fungi to reproduce. And this is also a way that they are going to be classified. So some adaptations of fungi include their preference for acidic environment or around pH 5. They can resist osmotic pressure like environments with high sugar and high salt. That's why molds can still grow on jams and jellies. Most fungi in nature are actually decomposers, and they help recycle the vital elements. Only few fungi are pathogenic on animals and humans and also in plants. We have used fungi in a variety of purposes. Some of the mushrooms are edible and morels are also edible. We use different types of mold to produce a variety of cheeses. Yeast are used to produce bread and also alcohol. And this mold called penicillium was the source of the antibiotic penicillin. Let's look more closely into this group of fungi called the yeast. So the yeast are unicellular fungi, so they can be spherical or oval in shape. They are not filamentous. They are just single-celled organisms. One unique feature of yeast is that they are facultative anaerobes. This means that they can live with oxygen or without oxygen. They have this ability to live without oxygen because they can undergo fermentation. So they can take carbohydrates and break it down to produce alcohol and CO2. So just like a common yeast called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, this is used to brew some beer or bake some bread. So here's a picture of your single-celled yeast cell. One way it can reproduce is by forming a bud. That bud can grow and eventually break off, or it can form a series of buds. So yeast can reproduce both asexually and sexually. So there are three ways yeast can reproduce asexually. First is through binary fission, when one yeast cell will divide evenly in half. Another way is through budding, just like shown here, and here is a bud, which is an asexual type of spore called the blastospore. Here is another example of a bud or a blastospore. A third way is when these cells will produce a series of buds, and this is called a pseudohypha, or a short chain of buds. Yeast can also reproduce sexually, and their sexual spore is called ascospore. Here is an example of ascospores. They are formed when two nuclei will fuse, there is genetic exchange, and they will form this sexual ascospores inside a sac called an ascus. And take note, the phylum where yeast are classified are based on the type of sexual spore. So yeast belonging in the phylum Ascomycota will produce the sexual spore ascospores. So that is very easy to match the phylum and the type of sexual spore. Now let's talk about the multicellular molds. So unlike yeast, molds are aerobic, meaning they require oxygen in order to survive, and they are multicellular. They usually start from a spore that will germinate and that will form a hypha or a filamentous cell. It will then elongate and can form new molds. So if we have a lot of hypha germinating from spores, this mass of hypha forms like a cottony mass, and that is called the mycelia. There are different kinds of hypha. Some hypha will have this separation called the septum, so they are called the septate hypha. Some hypha, they do not have this separation, so they are called aseptate hypha or synocytic because there is no division between the cells. Let's look at the life cycle of your typical bread mold. It usually starts with a spore that will germinate and produce a hypha. The hypha will then elongate and produce a mass of mycelia. So from there you have the reproductive hypha, and it depends on the type of mold. In this case, it will form a sporangium, which is an enclosure of all these tiny sporangiospores. And when that sporangium will burst open, lots of spores will then germinate and produce more hypha, more mycelia, and more sporangiospores. And so here is your asexual reproduction. The same type of bread mold can undergo sexual reproduction. In this case, you have the fusion of the plus and the minus hypha, and they will exchange genetic material and produce a sexual spore called the zygospore. So from the zygospore, a sporangium can emerge with lots of sporangiospores, and it will produce lots of spores that can germinate and form more mold. So this part of it is the sexual reproduction of the mold. Fungi can also produce different kinds of diseases, which is called mycosis. So every time you see this root word myco, it means fungi. So some diseases are systemic. They are deep within the body and circulates in the organ. Some of them are cutaneous type of mycosis, which affects the skin or the hair. Some are mycotoxicosis. meaning there are some toxins produced by this mold or this fungi. And some fungi are opportunistic. They are part of our normal microbiota. They do not normally cause disease, but when certain conditions occur, like for example, a person's immune system gets suppressed, and then this type of fungus can then cause disease, so it is called an opportunistic pathogen. Now let's put this together and look at different groups of fungi. Phylum Zygomycota, for example, produces zygospores as its sexual spore. Here is a picture of a zygospore. You have the fusion of the plus and minus hypha that forms this thick-walled zygospore. In terms of asexual reproduction, it will produce sporangiospores enclosed in a sporangium. Here is an example of that sporangium, that enclosure, containing lots and lots of sporangiospores. An example of this is Rhizopus, which also causes an opportunistic systemic mycosis, a type of respiratory disease. So when we look at a group or a phylum, Zygomycota, it is easy to match that up with the sexual spore, zygospore. Another phylum is the phylum Ascomycota, and the sexual spore is called the ascospores. Just like the yeast, which produces these sexual spores enclosed in an ascus. In terms of asexual reproduction, they produce this bud or blastospore. The molds that are members of this phylum produces a chain of spores called conidiospores. Here's an example of the tiny chains of conidiospores emerging from this mold. One pathogenic member of the phylum Ascomycota is Candida albicans, which causes a yeast infection, and it is an opportunistic cutaneous mycosis. Here is an example of oral candidiasis or thrush. One unique feature of this fungus is that it is dimorphic, meaning it can grow like a yeast, which is single-celled. It can also grow like a mold, which have more filamentous structure. So depending on the environment, it can have two forms. So that's why it's called a dimorphic fungus. Another member of this phylum is Trichophyton, which causes athlete's foot, which is a cutaneous type of mycosis. Yet another example is the mold Aspergillus flavus, which causes aflatoxin. It is a neurotoxin. And this toxin is found in peanuts and grains once they are in storage and they are contaminated by this Aspergillus flavus, then they can release these neurotoxins when we eat these peanuts and grains that are contaminated. So this is an example of a mycotoxicosis. The last group we're going to talk about is the phylum Basidiomycota. Again, it's easy to match the phylum with the sexual spore, which is called basidiospores. So this type of spores are on top of pedestals called the basidium. Example of that is this mushrooms. Under the mushroom, you'll have gills, and inside the gills, you will have the sexual basidiospores. So we just had a tour of a variety of different fungi, and I hope you appreciate the beauty and the diversity of this group.